And now let's kick off today's session with integrating rights-based frameworks into policy and practice, considerations, and implications beyond COVID-19. This session is moderated by KBHN Deputy Scientific Officer, Dr. Jennifer Zwicker, who of course has been at the conference presenting throughout the week. And we also have KBHN trainee Vanessa Thomas. Dr. Zwicker's research is aimed at improving outcomes for children with developmental disabilities and their families. Vanessa was my host during my Ask the Expert session yesterday. Her doctoral thesis aims to explore, together with youth and young adults with autism, experiences and related needs surrounding the complex disability disclosure process and requests for workplace accommodations to create knowledge translation outputs. Certainly, you know, as my son grows into a young man, these are topics that are critically important to me personally. This session will also be sponsored by CanFASD. And before I hand over to Jennifer and Vanessa, let's watch a short video from CanFASD.
We are the Canada FASD Research Network, your source for trusted evidence-based information about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. FASD is Canada's leading developmental disability. We work together to improve supports for Canadians with FASD. Learn more at www.canfasd.ca.
And now, Jennifer and Vanessa, it's all yours. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. And thanks to the Honorable Mike Lake and Jaden for talking about some of that momentum that we're really excited to carry on. And for building on a great quote that you quoted from one of our panelists, Krista Carr. So I wanted to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples and all the lands that we're on today. And while we meet on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of these lands that we call home and to reaffirm kind of our commitment and responsibility for improving relationships between nations and our own understanding of the local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. So I'm in Calgary, and I'll take an opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, the Kainai First Nation, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So this morning, we're focusing on the rights frameworks that underpin all of our work. This includes the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And as we also heard from Dr. Cindy Blackstock in our Fraser Mustard lecture, the UN Convention of the Rights of Children and the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Today, we focus on the UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities specifically, and we have an outstanding panel here today, and we're really excited to share some of these different perspectives. So we're going to talk about what researchers, families, and service providers, what perspectives they have, and kind of thinking about involving better integrating some of the rights-based perspectives into all of our work. So our panelists are going to discuss some of the realities currently of the UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, often shorthanded as CRPD. So if you hear people say UN CRPD, that's what we're talking about. And some of the context around COVID-19 and some of the recent federal policy announcements. So we're really excited to get started. I'm going to introduce my co-moderator. You just had heard our introduction. Vanessa Thomas is KBHN trainee as well, and she's on our Training and Policy Advocacy Committee. And Vanessa is going to introduce our speakers.
Thanks so much, Jen. So it's my pleasure today to introduce today's panel speakers, and I encourage you to check out the Kids Brain Health Network website to take a look at their full bios. So first we have Steve Etsy, who is a human rights officer with the Canadian Council for Disabilities. We have Rachel Martins, a family engagement facilitator with CanChild, Center for Childhood Disability Research. We have Dr. Keiko Shikako Thomas, an assistant professor with McGill University. Krista Carr, Executive Vice President for the Canadian Association for Community Living. We have Carrie Joffe, a lawyer with Arch Disability Law Center. and Michael Prince, professor at the University of Victoria. So we'll go through a few presentations today from each of the speakers in that order that I just described. So we'll have Steve, then Rachel, then Keiko, Krista, Carrie, and Michael, and then we'll have the opportunity for some questions and collaborative discussion. So take it away, Steve. This is a great session.
Okay, I'll start off by revealing my secret. I'm deaf, and I can't tell whether you're hearing me or not. So I asked if you could hear me, and then this big box came up and said, unmute yourself. So I'm unmuted, and I'm assuming you can hear me now. Great, yeah, okay, thank you very much. Hi, everybody, greetings from Halifax. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I was happy to catch the tail end of parliamentarian Mike Lake's presentation. I've had a chance to meet him on a number of different occasions. He's a real huge champion for the community and a real marvelous guy. It's interesting to hear what he had to say. I want to talk to you for a very few minutes today about the background of the Disability Convention, the CRPD. And I should say to you that my own background is around the convention. I was the advisor from civil society to the government of Canada during the days where we negotiated the convention from 2002 to 2006. And in those days, I was the human rights officer at Disabled People's International. So I worked here in Canada, but with DPOs from around the world to try to bring that convention forward. Having said that, what my task here is today is to try to set the stage for the more important discussions that will follow, to just talk about where the convention came from. Because I mean, it didn't just plop out of the air and land at the Kids Brain Health Conference in Calgary this morning. It's taken a long time, you know, and my work started around the convention in 2002, but that was really 40 years after the chain of events sequence that led to the convention started. And I just wanted to talk about that chain of events to give you a sense of where it came from and how it all fits together. So to start this, to see where it all began, I always like to think of the founding of the UN itself. I think that that's where we start to have international discussions about rights-based approaches to things. The UN was founded in 1947, and one of the first documents that was promulgated by the members of the UN was the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, or of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration talked about the kind of general rights that human beings ought to be able to expect. You remember this came from the days of the Second World War and all of the atrocities that the world had been through. So governments were trying to find a way to set up some standards about what people ought to be able to expect of their governments and of their fellow human beings. So the Universal Declaration talked about the right to freedom of worship, the right to education, the right to health, the right to employment, all of these kinds of things. It set it out at a very high level. And from that, in the early days of the UN, the late 40s, early 50s, they said that we really need to drill down and get a better sense of what these things are and come to some agreement about how we realize them or how we implement them. So that led to a process in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, the drafting and negotiation around two covenants. One is the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the other is the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So those two covenants kind of form the whole tree of human rights, if you want to call it that. And the three documents together, the Universal Declaration and the two covenants, are often referred to as the Universal Bill of Rights. They're the kind of bedrock human rights documents in the UN system, from which all others evolve. So you've got this Universal Declaration and the two covenants. together, and they are in place by the mid-1960s in the UN. And following that, then there began to be some discussions about the need for some other recognition, like kind of a recognition in the UN system that, you know, the world was not composed necessarily of just all white, straight European men. There were other people out there, and there was an effort to reach out and consider them in rights-based frameworks. So you have work in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s around the development of covenants and conventions that look at the right to be free from racial discrimination. They look at rights for women, look at rights for children. You've got all of these different kind of thematic conventions, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I gather you've talked about in another session, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, those conventions too. So you've got all of these kind of human rights conventions coming together in a sort of web that happened, and kind of with the Convention on the Rights of the Child in the 1990s, that sort of formed the framework, the human rights framework in the UN system. So that's the kind of background against which the disability community worked to try to advance our own set of rights in the UN system. And I'll talk really briefly about that. I'm mindful of our time here, and I don't want to go over my time. So we've got this kind of framework of the human rights system in the UN. Disability community is looking at this globally and saying, you know, we want to advance our rights as people with disabilities as well. There was a lot of resistance to this from the medical establishment and from the UN system itself, saying basically to people with disabilities, you don't need to have a separate convention because you are, of course, people, so you are covered by all of these other conventions. There was a lot of push back and forth through the 70s and 80s and into the 90s around this from governments around the world. There were a couple of efforts to get the UN in the 70s and 80s to elaborate a convention on the rights of people with disabilities. They didn't go anywhere for a variety of reasons. But there were other things that happened in the UN system that did move the agenda forward. You've got things happening in the UN, like the setup or the creation of the UN Standard Rules on the Equalization of Opportunities for People with Disabilities in the 1990s. That happened, and from that then, with the Standard Rules, there was a discussion in the UN system and the UN Human Rights Commission about the rights of people with disabilities. That led to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights taking a real interest in the situation of the rights of people with disabilities. And in the late 1990s, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who was the former president of Ireland, named Mary Robinson, commissioned a study to look at the rights of people with disabilities in the UN system and whether they were actually being supported by the UN system. So a couple of academics surveyed countries around the world and said, talk to us about what you do when you report on human rights in terms of the rights of people with disabilities. Show us examples from the rights reports that you write to the different UN committees about human rights. Show us where you're talking about people with disabilities. And unfortunately, very few countries were able to point to specific examples where they were able to do this. So by the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a real push, even from the High Commissioner's office, around the development of a convention on the rights of people with disabilities. In 2001, there was a conference in Durban, South Africa on anti-racism. And at that conference in 2001, the government of Mexico put a resolution to the conference floor in which they called for the creation of a committee in the UN system to consider whether or not there should be a convention on the rights of people with disabilities. That anti-racism conference document went to the UN and the General Assembly heard it. The General Assembly agreed to create a committee to consider whether there should be a convention on the rights of people with disabilities. That committee met in 2002 for the first time. That's where I started my talk, saying I got involved with this in 2002, the beginning of the ad hoc committee meetings, which from 2002 to 2006 worked to draft the convention. And that is the kind of background to the convention and where it came from. And with that, I think my time is pretty much up. So I'll wrap it up and pass it to my colleague to talk about how this UN convention is actually being used in their work today. Thanks very much.
Morning, everyone. I thought a lot about what I was going to express today, and I think for a little context, I think I'll start off that I got into the discussion of human rights by being invited by Keiko, actually, in 2018 with another parent and her self-advocate son to go to New York with a couple of researchers to the 11th Conference of the States Parties on the CRPD at the United Nations in New York, as you can kind of see our photos there. Basically, our goal was to present and discuss the subject of rights-based approaches to childhood disability policy in Canada. Now, as a mom, I can say it felt kind of like being called up to the Avengers. And so when last year, my superhero call came back to come to Geneva to support a coalition submission for the list of issues prior to reporting, I had developed some curiosities that I had to quell for myself. In terms of how I would exactly execute the idea of brokering knowledge with parents. I needed to know what they thought about and things like that. So I took to social media and I kind of informally polled about 2,000 parents and just basically asked from a generalized parenting support group standpoint and disability-centric ones, and asked the question, have you ever considered your child's rights? And in that particular context, about 90% of the individuals said no. Now, that kind of gives you a pretty big task at hand to kind of consider what that means for families. I can definitely say that in terms of the approach to the notion of disability rights from a childhood perspective, parents have been offered a rather piecemeal understanding as to the knowledge as to what helps to support them. As they sit kind of in the intersection between the CRPD and the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the necessity of really education on how much weight that this can play in terms of how their families can be supported while living in Canada becomes all the more important. And so the pandemic actually plays a really interesting kind of a role, given the fact that the perspectives of people that I would speak to when I went to Geneva last year was, oh, you went to Switzerland, did you eat all the cheese and the chocolate? Well, yes, but I also talked about a lot of much more important subjects and how we need to move the policy discussion forward in a much greater sense, given the fact that from ages 15 and under, we really haven't been recording a lot of data since 2006 on disabled children. So that needs to change in a significant fashion if we're going to consider what health looks like in childhood disability. It also plays a role in regards to acknowledging that these gaps are offering an opportunity for families to join in some significant partnerships. One current example would be, of course, the working group between Kids Brain Health Network and CASDA to facilitate the development of the National Autism Strategy, which also, as a point of note, also involves parent representatives from Kids Brain Health Networks and CanChild's online engagement community, parents partnering in research. There are upcoming studies related to pandemic policies that will demand a need for expanded community connection and engagement, and we really need to consider how we invest in those that have lived experience as well, and make sure that everybody has an opportunity to share their opinions and their experiences as well too. And so it would benefit greatly if we all kind of collectively developed some foresight and considered how we connect with that community of lived experience and in an authentic way as possible. And when knowledge is developed and when research is established, then how we move that knowledge into implementation without that pesky 17-year gap that we consider in research all of the time. So in terms of the experiences that I have had so far, in terms of reporting, I do feel that education plays a humongous role in terms of bringing families into the conversation as to how the CRPD and the CRC plays an integral role in how they raise their kids and how we can move forward together and build back better together. Now I'm just going to pass the torch on to Keiko.
Thank you, Rachel. This is great. I feel like everything is said already. So we know we need the researchers need slides. So yes, thank you so much. So this is really a pleasure to speak with all these colleagues. We've been going into different trips to Switzerland and New York, and for sure that's fun. But the real part that we want to talk is what's the work on the ground to be done. And I think that's the opportunity we have to share today and to brainstorm a little bit on how we can now work together towards implementing or having this idea of human rights really implemented, happening into practice in the research we do, in the services we developed, in the strategies and the policy initiatives. And that's a little bit of what I'll try to talk in my 5 minutes. So the CRPD 101, I think Steve gave a great overview, but as Rachel also mentioned, there's a lot of lack of knowledge, like from families, from researchers, from the entire community, in the childhood disability community, I think, about what the CRPD has to offer and how this framework can support our different fronts of work, either health services, research outputs, knowledge translation strategies, and what parents and families and youth can do to also contribute to the process. So that's what we're trying to convey here. And this is from the UN room in Geneva, where I have another picture of Rachel there from last year, but also what we can do as a research community and what we can all do together, you know, with the policymakers, with the civil society that is here represented, and with parents as well, and children and youth. So quickly to know that those two conventions, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, have specific articles, so specific aspects that should be considered when you talk about children with disabilities. And this intersection is what we're trying to build on, but it's not always obvious because children often get lost in the middle of the adults, right, in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the children's disabilities often get lost in the Convention on the Rights of Children. A specific article for the CRPD is Article 7, and that's the one we've been pushing in different strategies that I'll mention here. You're all invited to take a look and read and see what it talks about, but in essence, it brings together the best interest of the child, the idea that they have to express their view, that they have the right to participate in decisions pertaining to them. Canada, as Steve has mentioned, and Rachel too, has done one review for the CRPD recently, how it works. Everybody, every country that is a signatory has to make a review, has to tell the UN what they have been doing and how they have been doing. And that's a very simplified way to explain the process very quickly. So then the civil society, which is all of us, right, represented often by the organizations, some of them will be speaking in the panel today. And one of the problems on this review back then in 2016 was the lack of data on children with disabilities and what we could do together. And that's how we started, me, Rachel, others at the time, started to come together to present and to bring to this report that it's called a parallel report or alternative report, to bring some factors that can contribute, that what we know about research, for example, that could help informing what Canada is doing in relation to the convention and what we can do in other fronts, what we know about the parents' needs that also can be done. And that has been brought into different times presented for the UN committee, but also presented to the government of Canada during the alternative, the side event that Rachel has spoken about. This also goes to what is called this report, the list of issues that comes in after the report, after the convention. There's a report that then goes to government, and that circles back into the next cycle of actions that can be done. The government has to respond, that researchers can take inspiration to do some of the work and guide and try to address some of the questions as well. And that the community, so parents, youth, everybody, can use those also, these concluding observations, done by the committee to also inform the services. So some of the directions can be seen here that were specifically about children, and the question of earmarked budget, provide Indigenous children with disabilities access to services, and other information that you can all see. It's all public in the website. But all to say that then informs to this cycle and holds government accountable, but also service providers, researchers accountable to what can be done. We do know that then on the other side of the Convention on the Rights of Children, and I heard Cindy Blackstock talked about that, but we know that Canada, in relation to the Convention on the Rights of Children, is not doing well, right? Canada has this continuously stuck in the middle, and this year in this new report was even lower than the middle, right, in terms of when compared to other rich countries. And so we know that health for children in Canada, it means feeling happy, right? So most of the health indicators are associated with happiness, right, or well-being according to different parameters. But also we know for children with disabilities, and data from the previous Pulse survey from 2006, and now from the CHESI, from the Child Health Longitudinal Survey, showing that a lot of our children, for children with disabilities, it's something that you really have to fight for. Either because you have less access to leisure or have less access to other more passive activities, not access to community. All of these are aspects of health that are compromised and that you have to fight for. Those different conventions, they're here then to help children, help our service, help our research questions, to inform those bigger treaties to help assess this information through those different bodies. We have worked together with Rachel, other parents, other researchers, to explain what you as a parent or you as a researcher, as a trainee can do. And that includes continue participating in this conversation, respond to surveys. We did a few surveys about, as Rachel mentioned, how do you perceive your rights, what rights should be respected, and be attentive. We are coming soon with the dates for review and how you can contribute by saying, what are your real needs? How will you perceive or not your rights being respected in different aspects of your life and those of your children? We have created a framework to analyze the different consultations leading to the Accessible Canada Act, and we hope to inform that as well. So bringing together the CRC, the CRPD into the research and interacting with the policy development. And we hope to contribute to the next iteration of the CRPD, of the list of issues priority report that is being done now, to this figure that has been too much used, but to really working towards trying to level the playing field by bringing children with disabilities to these discussions, bringing families, and bringing researchers to this table so that we can all find the right messages, be informed, and help understanding how rights can be happening in your real life and contributing to a better quality of life for children and youth. And with that, I will pass then to Krista from Inclusion Canada to talk a little bit more. Thank you.
Thanks, Keiko. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel with so many people that I admire and share friendship with. Just for a little bit of clarity, I'm actually with Inclusion Canada, which is formerly the Canadian Association for Community Living, a national organization that works on behalf of children and adults who have an intellectual or developmental disability in their families. And my focus today is a little bit about how we realize the CRPD, or what does the CRPD mean in the context of COVID-19. And I guess I'm not probably going to tell too many people that are at this conference how the CRPD or how COVID-19 has really impacted people in this country. But just to highlight, I guess the first thing I would say is that it's really pulled back the curtain on the systemic gaps, discrimination, and ableism that we've always known has existed for people with disabilities, but the pandemic has just made it so much worse. And it's really shone a light on the precarious situations that individuals with disabilities, children, adults, families, have been living in. And governments, with the exception of a few in certain cases, have largely excluded people with a disability in pandemic response, or in some cases have been harmful. And so just wanted to touch on some of the things that, you know, we've really seen come out as a result of the pandemic, and how that links back to the CRPD and what the way forward might look like. Clearly, people were left vulnerable and without supports. Poverty issues were greatly exacerbated for families and for adults. Food banks closed down or had much less donations to give. People didn't have access to technology. They got their Wi-Fi services for free from public libraries, etc., and were no longer able to access them. Public transportation was often no longer safe or no longer available, and people had to resort to using much more expensive means of transportation. Families were trying to work from home while their children with disabilities were trying to learn from home, often without the supports that they would regularly be given at schools. Some governments even cut off funding for educational assistant supports during the pandemic. Childcare services were closed down. All kinds of services and supports were closed, and families were left without respite, struggling without access to workers or without access to PPE or the training in how to use it for their workers. People living in congregate care were cut off, and still are in many cases, from their family and friends, locked in their rooms in the name of safety and security for months and months and months on end. And where the virus did permeate congregate care facilities, for example, like in Participation House in Markham, Ontario, the results were absolutely devastating. Access to healthcare was very much compromised as a result of the pandemic. We saw triage protocols being released that deprioritized the lives of people with disabilities when life-saving equipment became scarce. We saw hospital visitation policies that excluded trusted supports, people who assist, and family members, friends, support workers, people who could assist with communication for individuals, which made them far more vulnerable in a healthcare system that was already overtaxed and overstretched. People showing up at the hospital for non-COVID related symptoms and being asked whether they had a do not resuscitate order on file. All kinds of systemic ableism and discrimination really came to light. And I'm only touching the surface of some of the things that we've seen as a result of this pandemic and continue to see. Now the CRPD, if it had been fully and truly implemented and embraced right now, would have been exactly what would have been needed in the context of a pandemic. It would strike the right balance in ensuring that people would already have access to the supports and services that they need. And just a few examples of that to highlight. And if you're not familiar with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I really encourage you to give it a read, because it's, if anything, it's like a beacon of light or hope. It's aspirational, and it's something that we're all striving so hard to get to. But Article 10, for example, that talks about the people with disabilities having the right to life on an equal basis with others. Or Article 12, that speaks to not just the right to education, but the right to a quality, inclusive education on an equal basis with others in communities where kids live. You know, and that so did not happen as a result of this pandemic in too many situations. The right to health care, particularly the requiring health professionals to provide the same quality of human rights-based health care to people with disabilities as everybody else gets access to. And Article 28 on the adequate standard of living and social protection, and I'm sure Michael Prince will talk more about that, but certainly if people with disabilities and their families had access on an equal basis with others to a good quality standard of living, people wouldn't have found themselves in the horrible situations that they did find themselves and are still finding themselves in as we go through this second wave of the pandemic. Particularly want to point out, though, Article 19, which is the right to live in community with support. And I feel very strongly, as do we at Inclusion Canada, that Article 19 really lays out the framework for a rights-based approach to disability supports in this country. And that is the beacon of hope that I think, among many other things, the CRPD really holds for Canadians with disabilities and their families. Because realizing that the CRPD would mean that people with disabilities, their families, would have the supports that they need to live quality, good, inclusive lives on an equal basis with others all the time in our society. Not just during a pandemic, not just during a time of crisis. It would mean it would be happening all the time. And when pandemics or terrible crises were to hit our nation, everybody would be they would be affected, the same as all Canadians are affected, but they'd be in quite different situations than they are right now. And I think that the very lives and the citizenship and the inclusion of people with disability in this country and their families are well worth our time. And so I think that we have to continue to strive to see Canada really realize and implement the rights that are prescribed in the UN CRPD, because we're way too far away from it right now. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Carrie Joffe.
Thank you very much, Krista, and I couldn't agree more with what you've said about implementing Article 19. I wholeheartedly agree that it's one of those key touch points in the CRPD that really reflects, what we're all striving to achieve, which is real inclusion and real lives in the community for everyone in our society, including people with disabilities. I was asked to spend my 5 minutes focusing on the CRPD reporting process, which I think Keiko has touched on a little bit. But I'll just give you a very brief overview of that process and share some reflections with you about how the CRPD and the reporting process has been used to promote the realization of CRPD commitments in Canada. Because, isn't that what's really most important here? How can we actually use this international convention to achieve better lives, better outcomes for people with disabilities in our country? So the reporting process is one of the mechanisms available at the UN for monitoring the implementation of the CRPD. And what happens essentially is that a UN committee reviews Canada's record on implementing all of the rights in the CRPD. And the committee is really tasked with the job of asking, how well has Canada implemented those rights, and in what areas does Canada need to improve? And to do that, this UN committee receives written reports and information from the Government of Canada, including all the provincial territorial governments as well. The Canadian Human Rights Commission, which is our national human rights institution, and also from civil society. Civil society is one of those sort of UN terms, which includes, as Keiko said, really pretty much all non-governmental actors and non-human rights institutions. And with the CRPD, it really tries to focus on organizations of and for people with disabilities, disability service providers, disability advocacy organizations, universities, and also other non-governmental organizations. And so the UN committee will take all of this information and then, based on that, issue a report. And that report is really the key output from this reporting process. And what's great about it is that it includes a whole bunch of recommendations to Canada for steps that Canada needs to take to better implement the rights in the CRPD, including, of course, the rights of children with disabilities, which, as Keiko said, flows from Article 7 of the CRPD. But rights related to children with disabilities are, of course, embedded in all of the CRPD articles, and so those recommendations from the UN really make recommendations to Canada in relation to children with disabilities across many of the other rights in the convention as well. Those recommendations from the UN are often quite concrete and specific. Just to give you one example, in 2017, after the UN's first review of Canada, the UN recommended that Canada collect disaggregated information on children with disabilities, particularly Indigenous children with disabilities, so as to formulate targeted programs to tackle the exclusion they face. And again, that's just one example. You know, there are many, many, many other recommendations related to children, which are very, very concrete and quite specific. So how have these recommendations from the UN review process been useful in Canada? Well, there's been lots and lots of very creative and interesting ways that people with disabilities and disability organizations have used these recommendations. One, so I'll try to give you just a couple of examples. After the first review of Canada in 2017 by the UN, those recommendations that the UN released led to federal funding for research and community advocacy projects related to a couple of rights, a couple of specific rights for people with disabilities flowing from the convention, including research projects on decision-making rights for people with disabilities and also the rights of women and girls with disabilities. So that's one way that the UN recommendations can really help to put disability rights issues on government's policy agenda and help to flow some resources to the community to advance research and thinking about how to implement those recommendations domestically. The CRPD also itself, I think, provides a very, very useful framework for all of us when we're thinking about developing rights-based approaches to policies, programs, and laws. I'm a lawyer, so I have to think about laws as well. And just to give you one quick example from the work that we do at Arch, we do quite a lot of work in education law and inclusive education, advocating for the rights of students with disabilities to have accommodations at school and be included in schools in their communities. And so we developed a submission on inclusive education in Ontario, which talked about the need to recognize the right to inclusive and free primary education for all students, including students with disabilities. The need to mandate that children with disabilities not be excluded from public primary or secondary education because of their disabilities. And the need to mandate the provision of effective individual supports and accommodations for students with disabilities in classrooms and in extracurricular activities as well. And our submission really drew upon a lot of the work that we do in education law and the families and students with disabilities that we speak to every day, but also really drew upon the framework in Article 24 of the CRPD, which is the article that talks about the right to inclusive education. And in that way, the CRPD provided a framework for, developing a rights-based approach to education. And we, in our submission, try to apply that framework in a particular context that we have in Ontario. And I think similar could be done across almost all of the rights in the CRPD. They set out rights-based frameworks and aspirations and goals that we're trying to achieve, and really could be applied, to the particular context that you're working in, whether it be municipal, provincial, or federal. So those are just two ways that those recommendations from the UN have been used in Canada. As I said, there are many other examples as well. And I think also many opportunities for researchers to partner with disabled persons organizations and disability advocacy groups, so that research topics are really shaped by the priorities identified by people with disabilities themselves. And also, I think there's lots of opportunities for researchers to support law and policy reform efforts that are already underway within the disability community itself. As well, I think lots of opportunities for families to get involved with disabled persons organizations to give input into that CRPD reporting process and the recommendations that come from the UN to Canada, and in that way, influence the process. So I'm happy to talk more about what those opportunities might be during the discussion portion of today's panel. Keiko and I are, trying to, or have been working together quite closely to try to bring together the sort of advocacy, policy, law reform side of things and the research side of things. And I think that's been really interesting and effective work, and a way to hopefully cut through that 17-year gap between research and implementation, because we're about to use the results of Keiko's research in a report that, that will be published very, very soon. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. Great to be with everyone. And I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Carrie, and good morning, everyone. I'm calling in and speaking to you from Vancouver Island on the West Coast. So delighted to be here today with you all. And my focus will be looking at the way forward and what that future may look like, particularly with a focus on the Government of Canada and the national level in terms of public policy and laws, and some of the opportunities that some of the other speakers have been mentioning already this morning. So I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples from where I'm calling from, where I work and I live. And before COVID, I got to play in this lovely territory of the Greater Victoria area, the Esquimalt and the Songhees First Nations. So let me go to my next slide, which really, in September, you may recall that Parliament resumed with a speech from the throne. And that's basically a very official way of the Government of Canada outlining its priorities and its plans for the coming session of Parliament. And in that throne speech, I want to just highlight a couple of key things. One was something that all the speakers have already mentioned about the impact of COVID for Canadians with disabilities. And as Krista Carr said, I think very eloquently and very graphically, COVID has disproportionately affected Canadians with disabilities. Not only that, many Canadians with disabilities have felt that they were one of the last groups to be recognized by government responses, if they got any responses at all. And I think Krista also mentioned that there was quite a difference between how the federal government has rolled out benefits and supports for many people, and the relative lack of initiatives by many provincial governments across the country, which is again added to people's sense of exclusion or marginalization during the last 7 or 8 months of this pandemic. The Government of Canada in this throne speech did a remarkable thing. It actually made a specific promise about a disability inclusion plan. And in that plan, it really identified 3 elements. And I'll speak very briefly about each of these in turn with you in the next few minutes. The first was a new Canadian disability benefit, an income security benefit. And quoting directly from the throne speech, that this would be modeled after the guaranteed income supplement for seniors. As some may know on this call and meeting, there is a low-income targeted benefit for low-income Canadians over the age of 65 who live in poverty. And the guaranteed income supplement has been around since the late 1960s, and it has been one of the most effective ways of reducing poverty among seniors in this country over the last 40 to 50 years. It's unusual in a throne speech to be that specific in terms of a particular policy and a particular design for that policy. Another element in this promised disability inclusion plan was a robust employment strategy for Canadians with disabilities. Now, as many of you already know, we've had a number of labor market programs for Canadians with disabilities for many decades. I think what this throne speech is signaling is that, and I don't think this is just because of COVID, but that there really has been an underinvestment in this country for many, many years in labor market supports, in employment services, and in other ways of helping people make the transition into workplace full inclusion as economic citizens, as contributors in the labor force. So robust to me is a promising word to mean, well, we should anticipate a more vigorous, a more meaningful investment, and possibly some policy and program changes. The third element in this promised disability inclusion plan is a better process to determine eligibility for government disability programs and benefits. Now, I should probably immediately caution or be specific here to say this will likely refer to federal government disability programs and benefits. Whether it will involve a wider conversation with provinces and territorial governments as to the eligibility rules around so many other services and programs in the provinces, whether it's in employment or housing or education or personal supports, it remains to be seen. But the first step would be that the Government of Canada would look within its own jurisdiction or fields of responsibility of the programs that it delivers. But inevitably, it will have to involve looking at how federal and provincial programs interact or don't interact very well at the present time. So there's some real interesting opportunities here for all sorts of civil society groups and organizations to engage in that conversation in the coming months. Now, just talk about the first element, the promised Canada disability benefit. Krista Carr talked about the UN Convention and Article 28 around the right to an adequate standard of living. And so this promise in the throne speech speaks directly to that. One of the experiences of the last 7 or 8 months during COVID is the realization that the Government of Canada lacks an inclusive, effective income security program that would reach out to the majority of Canadians with disabilities who are in financial need. And I think it's been frustrating for a lot of us, and I know it's been frustrating for certain politicians federally to see that we lack a policy and a program that would have flowed out money quickly and easily to Canadians with disabilities, as we witnessed with things like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and through the Employment Insurance Program. Those weren't perfect, but boy, were they fast, and they got money out very quickly. A lot of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Canadians with disabilities watched and waited for a similar kind of response to provide for income support. And it was only in late October that we finally saw this first one-time payment of $600 start to flow to certain people with disabilities who qualified for the disability tax credit or a few other programs. So the promise, as you'll see on this slide, is we don't know many specifics about the promise, but one thing that Minister Qualtrough, the federal minister responsible for disability and inclusion, has said is that the intention for this new disability income benefit would be for Canadians who are of working age population. In other words, usually that's between ages 18 to 64. And then there are other programs for seniors, and there are other benefits for younger people that would be there. This would be potentially, and this is our aspiration, I think, as a movement and as a community across the country, that it would be a guaranteed, adequate, livable monthly income. It would likely be income tested. And so it would also have to be reported against other income or earnings that people may have. I hope it will be indexed to inflation so that the value and the purchasing power of this benefit retains its value through the years ahead. Inflation is low right now, and so this might not seem like a big deal, but there have been times over the years where we've seen the economy heat up, and inflation in our own lives, where inflation was running at 6, 8, 10, 12% a year. We need to ensure that this program builds into it for future implications of inflation. Another key feature of this plan benefit is that you do not need to have a job to qualify for it. You do not need to have a record of labor force attachment, like as for the Canada Pension Plan Disability or for the employment insurance benefits. you do not need to have any workforce participation. At the other side, though, I hope the program is designed in a way that there are generous incentives for people who are able to work to be able to do so without fear of losing this benefit. And so groups like Krista's Inclusion Canada and others are coming out with some fascinating and important policy recommendations, that there be a very generous earnings exemption, somewhere in the neighborhood of $15,000 a year that you could earn through employment and not have to worry about losing a nickel or a dime or a loonie of this proposed benefit. That's important. One other thing I just want to stress about this planned Canada Disability benefit is it's not intended to be a replacement for the costs that people incur, families and individuals incur for services and supports. This is meant to be a supplement. So this is not to mean other programs will be cut or reduced. In fact, if anything, they ought to be enhanced. We can talk about that more later. I just also want to remind, because I know I'm talking to some families and people with young people under the age of 18, to say, well, perhaps this disability benefit may not immediately benefit your family, but it will eventually. But in the meantime, I want to remind our attendees at this conference that the Trudeau government also committed in their 2019 platform to double the value of the child disability benefit from $240 a month to $480 a month. That's a significant couple of $2 billion commitment. This was all pre-COVID. I expect the government will honor this commitment. And certainly if they move forward quickly, as I hope they do, on the new Canada Disability benefit for adults, that in tandem with that, in conjunction with that, they would also meet this election campaign promise of theirs to double the child disability benefit. As you probably know, that's a tax-free monthly payment to families who care for a child with a significant, severe, or prolonged impairment on a physical or mental functioning. So watch your space on that. We need to focus on that, not just this promised disability benefit as well. I'll move a little more quickly. Here we look at the second part of the disability inclusion plan promises a more robust employment strategy for Canadians with disabilities. And again, the details are to come on this probably in a federal budget, perhaps next February or March, I would hope. And we know from a wide range of research, both here in Canada and internationally, that there are several best practices or positive approaches that we know work. And I've listed some here, whether it's mentorship programs, paid work experiences while attending high school. That's absolutely critical. We need to get away from just having people with significant disabilities going to a local sheltered workshop, or fake work, as I call it. We need to practice inclusion. We need to have guidance counselors and school teachers and school principals I know what the convention means in terms of opportunities for employment while attending school. We need to be creative with local employers and unions and professional associations, local colleges, and so forth. Targeted wage subsidies is a controversial part of the debate over the last many decades. People in the disability community have been divided over the value or the utility of using wage subsidies. However, through COVID, we have seen millions of Canadians have access to wage subsidies. We may have new ways of thinking about how to use some of these policy tools going forward that we had old attitudes towards because they were seen as atypical or exceptional or not the usual way to do things. Well, they're not, but in the last 8 months, they have become part of the new normal. We need to think about whether they should be part of the new policy toolkit going forward. But we do know that targeted wage subsidies for young people work. It helps them get the experience and attachment into the labor force. And inclusive work settings. Krista talked about this and others have. True inclusion, not segregated, not employment enclaves, but working alongside others in workplaces in the regular labor force. I know that will involve major investments, workplace accommodations, attitudinal shifts, those can happen, and there are lots of good examples across the country. And the Ready, Willing, and Able initiatives of Inclusion Canada and partners have had some remarkable and very positive results over the last several years. So these are conversations that families and parents and others can have with their allies, with local chambers of commerce, Rotary clubs, their schools, and so forth. We need to broaden out that conversation to truly make it a more robust employment strategy for all Canadians. We know there's going to be a lot of attention in the recovery phase of the pandemic to people who have lost their jobs. There are a lot of Canadians with disabilities who didn't have jobs in the first place. We need to make sure they get into this new labor force very challenging ways. The third element in the disability inclusion plan is a better process to determine eligibility for government programs. Again, I just remind you, the focus, I think, will be on federal government programs. The disability tax credit is an old program. Many people probably on this conference are well aware of it. It's primarily of benefit to older Canadians, particularly over the age of 50 or 55. But I wanted to note that there is a significant proportion. I mean, there's about 1.2 million people are eligible for the disability tax credit. But there's a sizable proportion, over 200,000, are DTC registrants who are under the age of 18. So this is a not insignificant benefit for younger people and youth. So there's a lot we could talk about the DTC. I will not really get into it here other than to say it's an important gateway program. And I hope with the new Canada Disability Income Benefit that it uses an eligibility criteria that is far more liberal or generous or inclusive than the fairly restrictive rules around the disability tax credit. Again, this is where families can share their experiences and frustrations and perhaps their support for what eligibility could look like for a new broad-based income security program for Canadians with disabilities. You have the wisdom, you've got the experience. We need to hear it loud and clear over the next many months. So finally, let me just say in terms of next steps, this inclusion plan, and I'll just add that Minister Carla Qualtrough now is referring to this as a disability inclusion action plan, which I'm glad to hear she's adding the word action. Really, it tries to address three big issues. One is poverty. And COVID has just shone the light on that again and again. How do we move towards ensuring Canadians living with disabilities have access to an adequate income? And for many, that will require a new national income benefit from the Government of Canada. We need to work together on that. Secondly, this inclusion plan looks at the issue of continued persistent unemployment or underemployment and segregated employment. And there's some real opportunities to move on that. Thirdly, there's a recognition by this inclusion plan that a lot of federal programs have old, antiquated eligibility rules that do not work well together. That's been shown glaringly during this COVID crisis. And I think there's a political will there to move forward on that. I would hope, and I think my co-panelists would share in this, I would hope that we move forward on this in a non-partisan, across political parties. This is something that all parliamentarians, like the Mike Lakes of the Conservative Party and others that we know who are champions, who get this, whether they're senators or members of parliament across all parties, to lend their support and make sure that in a minority parliament, we get this to start happening sooner rather than later. Who knows how long this parliament will be around, but we need to mobilize quickly, and together I think we can start to make some momentum on this in the early days. Finally, I'll just want to acknowledge that a lot of these issues also tie into provincial programs and benefits, and whether that's education, housing, personal supports, and community services. So what the federal government is promising as a disability inclusion plan is one part of that. And again, as in everything in Canada, there are intergovernmental dimensions. Those will be complicated and are necessary. But in the short term, I think there's a real opportunity at the national level to advance meaningfully on a human rights kind of agenda, some of the key articles in the UN Convention. And I'm just delighted to be part of this panel today, and want to just share with you, although we are living through some tough, hard times, I still am optimistic. And I know people like Steve, who've been around this a lot longer than I have, the bright flame of optimism remains. And with this throne speech statement, which is an unprecedented commitment to be included in a throne speech about a disability inclusion plan and a new national income benefit, we have an opportunity, ladies and gentlemen. Let's seize it and work together. Thanks very much. And I turn it back to our chairs, I guess, or panel leaders.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everybody. That was absolutely fantastic, and was a master class in getting everybody up to speed on where we're at around the UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, particularly relating to youth with neurodevelopmental disabilities and their families. So we heard from Steve, who talked about the history on the UN CRPD, Rachel and her perspective on being called up to the Avengers as a family participant in the UN CRPD process, Keiko on youth with disability and kind of the researcher perspective, Krista on COVID-19 and some of the specific considerations that we need to be mindful of in the UN CRPD, Carrie on monitoring of the UN CRPD, and Michael gave us some great context around some of the more recent disability policy announcements and some of the context for youth with disabilities. So we want to remind you that we have a Q&A on the side, so feel free to post your questions, and Vanessa and I will be monitoring that. But we wanted to, first of all, put it back to our panelists here and talk a little bit more on what organizations like Kids Brain Health Network or other advocacy or research organizations can really be doing in this most recent COVID-19 context, but also the policy context that we have that Michael outlined. What, from a researcher, from a family perspective, from a service provider perspective, what would you suggest that folks can do individually and as organizations to kind of start moving some of this conversation along? And I'll ask, is there anybody that wants to kind of kick us off to jump in on that? Maybe Keiko, do you want to take that on?
I think we have, as Michael said, I think all of us had this highlight. I think it's an opportunity time, right? I think we have a unique, I see from looking at Vanessa, like thinking from my trainee time at NeuroDefNet back then, that became Kids Brain Health Network. At that time, I was finishing my PhD, was an idea of like how we could interact with policy. Is that something we can contribute to? How we can contribute to? And look at us like a few many years later, but having this panel and active conversations, having working groups with different policy strategies. I know Mike Lake's talking about the autism strategy. We are talking about, UN convention. Within COVID, we had strong partnerships with WHO. So we can inform all those systems, and we can really actively do things, concrete things, right? Action. I like what Michael said about like action plans, right? So it's not intention. There are lots of good intentions, but I think there are also some concrete action that is ongoing now. And I think this creates opportunities for us to learn more about, right? So for the researchers in the room to learn more about how the conventions can be studied, what type of information we can convey that can help people like, Steve, Carrie, Krista, who are on the ground doing work, right, in close connection with government and others. So I think we can contribute. Carrie mentioned the example like of one of the projects we're doing together. I think it's great. Like the more we can work together, the closer the gap stays, right? And also the ways of understanding, because I think a lot is on the mystery box of policy and, in the UN and the secrecy around it. And it's really not that mysterious. It's not linear, right? It's not that you do research here, this will be applied there, some concrete action will happen at the end of the line, but it's influencing, informing, working together. And I think we learn in this process, right? We learn in the coffee conversations and dinners and lunch, but we also learn by this ongoing interaction, right? By learning the process, we can think of better ways to contribute. We can teach parents, work together with youth, you know, to educate them. Yesterday, I'll wrap up, I speak too much, but yesterday we had a session with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, right, on their development of the monitoring CRPD framework, and they wanted to call youth, right, because they didn't have too much representation on their survey of children and youth. And it was great. Like, we had one of the youth from Child Bride who came to the session, and he was asking the question. There was a lot of questions like, what does monitoring mean, right? Because we speak like, oh, domestic monitoring as if something that everybody knows what they're talking about. And his example, which I found fantastic, I'll share with you, was monitoring means, he said, for me, he has autism. He's a 17-year-old who has autism and epilepsy. And he said, monitoring for me means like all the machines that my mom attached to me before I go to sleep. So if I have a seizure in the middle of the night, you know, she can come and rescue me, and it keeps me safe. So I think if we understand monitoring, domestic monitoring, as something that can keep us all safe, right, as a community, I think this is a great example of how we can exemplify, how we can make concrete plans, and I think we all have a contribution to that. So I think opportunity is my is my word here.
Thanks, Keiko. Is there anybody else in the panel who wants to respond to that question or also comment on some of the perspectives that have been presented here? Carrie, were you wanting to jump in? Oh, I think you're on mute there.
There we go. I just wanted to echo what Keiko said about action plans and working together. You know, a lot of the officials in government that and in Parliament that I've spoken with are really looking for recommendations from the community, but based in evidence, right? So an evidence-based approach to policy or to law reform recommendations. And we need researchers to work with us to develop that evidence base, you know, and I mean, the project that Keiko and I have been working on together, it's a project about looking at the Accessible Canada Act and the consultations that took place with people with disabilities to get their input into the development of that legislation, and trying to think about how do we create processes for the development of laws and regulations that really truly are meaningful and for people with disabilities, and meaningfully include them in the process, because we know that the processes that the government currently uses are really not satisfactory. And so that project, the way we've tried to approach it is by putting together a team of, you know, we're lawyers, so we have, we bring that perspective. We have a number of disability advocacy and community groups that bring a community perspective. And Keiko's team at McGill is really bringing an evidence-based approach. And all of that is going to team up together to develop the recommendations that we make to government about how to reform these processes to make them more meaningful and inclusive. And I hope that government will take those recommendations much more seriously and much more to heart because of the evidence base that supports them, right? It's not just us and our partners saying this, but we actually have research to back it up. So I think that those partnerships are really, really critical, and I think can really strengthen the advocacy work and all of the goals and CRPD implementation rights that we're all trying to work towards. So I just also want to say thank you to Keiko for that wonderful partnership, and you know, really encourage others to kind of explore similar kinds of partnerships.
Thanks, that's a great example. Yeah, Rachel? And then Steve. Yeah.
From a family perspective, I definitely would have to talk about a few aspects. One of them being that research partnerships with people with lived experience can be a complicated thing, which deserves one conversation that I could probably go on for hours about. But within conversations within the now, I think we need to consider within the pandemic setting that some of the plans that were made were done in haste and panic and trying to figure out, but now we're realizing that COVID isn't leaving anytime soon. And so we need to consider what those conversations about rights-based approaches look like with boots on the ground. One of them being that I'm going to go out on a limb, I'm going to say that rights-based conversations are a form of patient and family-centered care. Because in the system that we are kind of duking it out with right now, you have as well an unfortunate form of side effect of this pandemic has been systemic ableism and cherry picking disability policy, things like that, because somebody is inconvenienced by the idea of wearing a mask. Whereas we have a very relevant need with some children who have an inability to wear them for one instance or another. But when it comes to the resources of understanding how to have these conversations, parents are left with pretty much the resources of people having epic video fits in stores in terms of, you know, having disagreements and things like that. We need more opportunities to talk about what it means to have a calm self-advocacy. We need to talk about what this looks like on a healthcare center. We need to walk parents through the opportunity to say, okay, is there a relevant space upon which we can talk about being able to wear a mask and learning how to do so? And if that is not the case, then what does an adapted life during a pandemic look like? And because if we're left with only a minute amount of resources for families to understand exactly what this means, they're going to find that community and connection elsewhere. And we want to continue to facilitate and create those bridges of trust between clinicians and families as well too. So on the ground, I think that this is a very important conversation to have.
Yeah, that's such a great perspective. Thank you. Steve, did you have a comment?
Yeah, thanks very much. Kiko mentioned the fact that the Human Rights Commission did a consultation yesterday, and I just wanted to flag that because it's part of a larger process. When Canada passed the Accessible Canada Act last year, one of the things that, as part of that act, was the designation of the Canadian Human Rights Commission as a domestic monitoring mechanism on the CRPD here in Canada. So that's a line in the act that said the Human Rights Commission is now the domestic monitoring mechanism, but nobody really knows what that is, and that's why they're doing these consultations. The act gave the commission $2.5 million over 5 years to actually design a process around domestic monitoring of the convention. And if folks are interested in getting involved in these kinds of things, I would suggest to you that that's where the action is right now, what's happening with the Human Rights Commission and what our disability organizations are doing along with that, because you've got the work of the Human Rights Commission, or the National Human Rights Institution, as they call it, but you also have, at the provision of the convention, a space that's carved out for civil society organizations to work to domestically monitor the convention. What we've seen with the monitoring work, as we go into the second round of it, is, you go to Geneva once every 4 years, and you get to table a 40-page report. You think about it, the convention has 30 operative articles that talk about things like the right to health, the right to education, the right to life, all of these things. The report that the government files talks about each of these 30 things, and they talk about it in each of 14 jurisdictions, the provinces, the territories, and the federal government. So you just think about that in a grid and how much they actually get to talk about the details of any one of these things. It's not very much, right? But when you think about the possibility of doing this domestically without all the constraints of the 10,000-word reports and things like that, I think there's a real opportunity for a very rich discussion and an opportunity to use monitoring as a way to really drive implementation of a rights-based approach to working with people with disabilities. So I'm hopeful, interested to see what the Human Rights Commission is going to do. Thanks.
Thank you. That's such a great perspective, and I think gives us all something to think about in kind of how we can contribute to more domestic contributions there. Vanessa, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. It's a very interesting conversation, and you also addressed a lot of components from the first question I was going to ask, specific to research. And if we have time at the end, I would love to chat a little bit more, I think, as well, of all the trainees listening today, a little bit more about how trainees can really help support and move this work forward. But the next question, maybe we can direct this more towards Krista and Michael to start the conversation off, since you haven't had the chance to share your thoughts yet. But our question is, much of our rights commitment, strategy, and policy is developed federally, while services and programs are provided provincially or locally. So what are some approaches to better ensure that local programs are federal commitments?
I can start, Michael, if you want. Just a couple of thoughts on that. I think the first thing that I'm not necessarily proud of us for in Canada is that we hide behind our federalism. So we often make excuses when we're reporting to the UN, where you'll see the federal government say that they then can't, do certain things because these are the responsibilities of the provinces, and the provinces aren't responding, or they aren't, cooperating or collaborating. And so it's interesting. And I think part of the starting point, first of all, is to say that in order to ratify the convention, which is a process that you do when you sign on and you agree, it means that you are agreeing to the convention. When Canada did that, it had to have the sign off of all the provinces and territories. And so that means everybody agreed to the convention, not just parliamentarians in Ottawa. And I think that there's a real role for all of us to be reminding our provincial governments that they have an equal responsibility under the convention. And now that we've ratified we have the optional protocol, we finally put that into place. I hope we're going to see more tests of that coming through. So I guess that's the first comment that I'd make. The second comment that I would make is to say that I think what can be done. I would go back to provincial governments are equally bound by the convention, but I think they like to think they're not, that it's just something that the federal government did and that they can just kind of ignore, like they do all kinds of other things. And I think that we have to push for more federal, provincial, territorial collaborations, more meetings of ministers federally with ministers provincially, more discussion about what the obligations are for a country that has ratified the convention. And just more of a general awareness and advocacy from community and really at all levels, that we all agreed to this, people. We signed on to this, we agreed to it, and now our responsibility is progressive realization, which means we have to be seen to be doing things to implement this. I mean, you don't sign it and the next day you're compliant with it. But what are we really doing to realize the rights that are made available to people under the convention? So those are just a couple preliminary thoughts.
Thank you so much, Krista. Yeah, Michael, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I would just echo what Krista said, and your question is, how can we ensure that local programs and services align with federal commitments? I would say, just to paraphrase what Krista just said, how would they align with everyone's state commitments as parties to the UN Convention? To put it, so, Steve mentioned the Canadian Human Rights Commission is identified in the Federal Accessibility Canada Act as the monitoring mechanism. There's no reason why provincial human rights commissions, in partnership with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, equally play a robust or ongoing important role in monitoring. Most of the services that Canadians rely on in their day-to-day lives are under provincial jurisdiction, not federal. And these aren't federal commitments, really. They're international commitments by provincial governments and territorial governments. I was struck by the Prime Minister's statement yesterday or the day before, where he basically said to premiers and to mayors, I think he visited Alberta, he'd been talking to a couple of mayors in Alberta, but he reached out and said, if we're not doing something you think we need to do as the government of Canada, let us know. I can't remember the last time I heard a government of Canada say that. It's during a global pandemic and a crisis. That's not the usual way we conduct our intergovernmental relations, and we will probably return to our more typical way, which is finger pointing and buck passing, unfortunately. But wouldn't it be nice if that was kind of the conversation between premiers and Prime Minister, or as Krista said, between ministers responsible for education across the country, or ministers responsible for children and youth services, or social services, or housing, and that there was a human rights lens and a disability perspective applied to that. Going forward, substantial implementation of the Convention and human rights will require provincial governments to step up in a way that we haven't yet really witnessed. I'm not letting the government of Canada off the hook, but for families and their allies, the advocacy and work has to be province by province, city by city. That makes it really hard work. That makes it a long journey. But the thing about federalism is we can always find somewhere in the country pockets of progressive practice. It might seem dark or frustrating on housing in your province right now, but there's somewhere else probably there's some interesting things going on, or in education, or in personal supports. And we need to have those conversations. It puts an unfair burden, though, on families and local community groups to have to do this on their own. They need assistance. And this is where governments should be providing more additional supports to parent groups and families and to civil society organizations to do this work. Because if we don't do it, it's probably not going to happen, or it's going to happen awfully slowly. So that's the way I read the lay of the land. We have provincial accessibility laws in 4 or 5 provinces. We have human rights commissions. We need to work with them and reach out and form partnerships that perhaps we haven't previously thought of. That's why I mentioned in my remarks groups like chambers of commerce, or trade unions, or guidance counselors in high schools, groups that we might not, we interact with, but often don't think of them as key partners in a movement. So thank you.
Wow,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh.
We
Go
have
ahead,
a
Jen.
couple questions. Sorry, we have a couple questions from the audience, and I'll point this more towards I guess Rachel and Keiko and Carrie, because there's a lot of discussion about that, as Carrie had described, that civil society at large, which is a large group. How would you, if as folks of part of the civil society, being researchers, families, service providers, can you give us some specific organizations or groups that you think people could engage with, or if they want to engage with government, how would you suggest they go about that? Are there any kind of specific pieces of advice that you'd give? Does anybody want to take that on first?
And jump in,
Keiko,
and then
go ahead.
others can. So I think that right now, considering the current scenario, I think there are 2 paths to engage that are pretty much happening now. So for people interested in interacting right now, I think the easy way is through the Canadian Human Rights Commission, as I mentioned and Steve mentioned. So the process of developing this monitoring framework is undergoing, right? It's ongoing. So there is an email that they provided yesterday that is a direct, like if you have any specific questions, and I can pull it and find in a minute to give to you all. But because they are in the process of developing this framework, I think it's a good moment to impart, right, to provide opinion for that. In relation to the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, they are also considering creating a list of resources and training opportunities for the community at large about the CRPD and the articles and whatnot. So I think that's one. Two, then for the CRC, for the Convention on Rights of Children side, that there was a recent set of consultations where many of us participated for the parallel report, and we draft one, and we can provide updates next year on that. And the government is now doing the response. The government body responsible for that is the Public Health Agency of Canada for the response to the CRC committee. So they also have, they run sessions this week too, right? So it's all happening this week, but they're also open, and there is a contact email which I can find. And if people have ideas or questions or suggestions, so again, so that government can craft this response to the UN committee, which, as Steve also mentioned, is in the actual committee meetings, it's very limited, right? How much we can speak, it's that many minutes, that many words. But we can use these documents to then go to your provincial governments, right? To your the provinces that have child advocates or disability advocates and officers, right? Those documents can be used as a legit official document saying this is what you should be doing. So those are two opportunities that I think are good places to go: the Public Health Agency and the Human Rights Commission. And then Carrie and Steve are also working with another group of organizations to on the list of issues for the CRPD. So I'll let them speak. But those are, I guess, opportunities right now that are easy to access in a sense.
I think for families, there's
Rachel,
a lot
did you
of
want to jump in?
opportunity for sure. I think with families, there's a lot of opportunity to engage on a social media level. Some places like Keiko mentioned are definitely important ones. In order to stay in the loop, basically to cheat any social media algorithm, just engage in the comment section of any posts and things like that. That can make sure that you are informed, join mailing lists. There is also Child Bright Network as well. They are the SPORE network, so it's kind of an all-encompassing childhood disability space upon which you can learn a little bit more about what sort of questions are being asked and perhaps weigh in on important subjects. Inclusion Canada as well too. I always find their social media platform absolutely fascinating in terms of how they bring down the complex language to a more accessible fashion as well too. You can always even follow me on Twitter, because I'm always bringing a lot of these information opportunities to families and saying that, this is an important space to do so. On a local level, I can definitely say that to encourage more parent organizations to join civil society status and engage in the reporting level or opportunities as well too, is well within your rights to do so. And it is a bit nerve-wracking to jump into, but at the same time, it does not take too long to do so. And then you can actually contribute to as a part of the reporting process, and talk about unique things that you can join in on as well. Other than that, as well, I can say from an Alberta perspective, we have the Calgary Ability Network, which is actually a coalition that is looking to create an accessible Alberta Act. These are all interesting opportunities that do come with just kind of doing a little bit of detective work. And the nice thing about social media platforms as well too is the longer you engage in a specific subject, the more they're going to recommend organizations to you as well too. So in a big complex world, it's kind of computer math doing a lot of the work for you.
Yeah, thank you. So it's like Krista was saying, first of all, read the UNCRPD, because there's a lot, it's very inspirational, and just start getting involved, right? It's kind of, I think, part of the message. Vanessa, did you have a final question you wanted to pose?
Yes, I did. Thanks, Jen. So bringing back to the trainee perspective and the trainees listening today, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to the specific role of trainees and how we can play a part in being a part of moving this work forward. And then I think more broadly speaking as well, talking to the role of data and research in informing disability policy and what specific type of information we need to address some of these gaps that you've been talking about today. Not sure who wants to jump in first.
It's Carrie. I'll just make a brief comment about that, and I'll leave it to those in the field of research and data to actually talk about what's needed. But I'll just say that I think data, when we're talking about CRPD implementation, sort of both up and down, and by that I mean
Can you hear? Yep, there's Carrie's back. Just quick freeze. You're okay.
Froze.
Am I back? Okay. Oh,
You're back.
I'm so sorry about that. I was just saying, when we're thinking, I think data is absolutely critical, both from the point of view of giving input to the United Nations when it reviews Canada and makes recommendations to Canada. Data is critical to feed into that process. And also when, on the ground, when we're making recommendations for changes to laws, policies, programs, data and evidence is absolutely critical to both convince politicians to do the right thing, take our recommendations. Oh, gosh.
We can hear you okay.
Yeah, don't worry.
Oh, you can hear me still? Okay. Sorry, everybody. Obviously having internet connectivity issues. I just wanted to encourage everybody to have a look at the parallel report that was put together by civil society for Canada's first review at the United Nations. I can send the link to Jen or to one of the other conference organizers so that you can share it with everybody. And in that report, there's a whole section about where some of the gaps are in data and evidence for people with disabilities, and some recommendations that civil society put to the United Nations about steps that Canada should take to fill some of those gaps, to address some of those gaps. So I'll send that link around, and I think that's a really great starting point for people, who are trying to think about what kind of data still needs to be collected and how they can make a contribution there.
That's awesome. Thank you.
I could
Go ahead.
jump in quickly, and I think the time it's finishing. So one of the slides I showed, and I'll be happy to circulate, we're finishing this infographic of steps and where people can contribute in the process, both for the CRPD and the CRC, which also has active links to the report, to the parallel report, and to the concluding observations, to pretty much all of the documents that we've mentioned, all of us. So I think those for trainees, Vanessa, to go back quickly to your question, I think it's just get informed, get involved, ask the questions, talk to people, don't be shy to, as Carrie, Crystal, everybody said, like, really people want to know, your research may count, or where to find information. You may not have it yourself, and that's the example for the first report, right? In 2016, when Steve first asked me, like, do you have any information about children with disabilities? That was way back then. And I just emailed everybody I knew, like, who has any information that we can put in this report in 2 weeks that has to go on, right? So, and that's, you have to get used. I think for trainees, it's a good learning. For me, it has been that working with policy and with organizations and with families, and that requires a lot of flexibility, ability to respond fast, and to be willing, to drop what you're doing and get to do this next important thing, because it is important and everything is timely in policy, right? Things won't wait until your study is pretty finished and published and polished, right? Sometimes you just need to present the best information you have, but knowing that this information is better than not presenting any information at all, right? And either someone will take what you're showing and will put into another report that will then go into a recommendation, or someone else will, if it's not you, someone will, right? So some information is better than none. I think it's something I've been learning, like, it's to be available and be engaged in those conversations. And eventually you are among the experts and they're all your friends, and they will keep calling you if you were available once, right? So I think this is kind of the message for trainees.
Thanks, Keiko. That's a great message. Just to wrap, I just wanted to ask everybody, kind of very quick a vision for the future. What do you hope? What do you hope for kind of the implementation of rights, particularly around youth with disabilities? Rachel, did you want to start with just kind of a quick wrap up reflection? Where are we going? Where you hope we're going?
Short version, I think that the story I shared for our previous session on Tuesday about my son wanting to pinch people and engage in, important subjects, which to him was the soundtrack from the movie Moana. You want to have opportunities to create the best life possible. And that's, by and large, that's what parents are looking for.
Thank you. Krista?
Boy, that's a big question, and it's one I think about all the time. I guess if I were to say it quickly, I would say that my vision would be that parents of the children that I support on a day-to-day basis and all children with disabilities in this country, that their families and that their children would have the same opportunities that my family and my children who do not have disabilities have, and that I often take for granted, even though I do this work, and I have to stop and pause all the time and think about how incredibly fortunate and privileged my family and my children are. And I don't want to ever lose sight of that. And what I hope is that we can give that to every single child and family in this country.
Thank you. Carrie?
I think if I have to pick one thing, I would say that one of the recommendations that came from civil society in 2017 was the need for a national action plan on CRPD implementation. And we still don't have that. As Michael said, we have commitments from the federal government on key issues related to specific rights in the convention, but we don't have a plan that speaks to how we're going to really implement and realize each and all of the 30 active rights in the convention. So if I had my way in a dream world, that's what we would all be working with the government to develop.
Thank you. Michael?
I guess it would be a fundamental cultural shift in this country. I think we see that with the medical assistance in dying legislation discussion right now. There's still, what has been revealed, I think, during COVID is the dark systemic ableism that continues to this country. In fact, most Canadians wouldn't know what systemic ableism meant as a term. And we have so much more work to do. To me, one of the promises of the Accessibility Canada Act is that in part it is a cultural project. It is about shifting fundamentally the attitudes and beliefs of all Canadians. And we are moving along that way, but that would be my one big thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve?
Gosh, how about if I just say all of the above? I don't think I have anything to add. My colleagues have made it all very clear. I agree with everything they said. So let me instead say thank you for the opportunity to be with you here today. I've enjoyed my time, and I hope it's been helpful for all of you folks out there in Zoom land, wherever you are. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Keiko, any final reflections?
I think I'll go with Steve. Perhaps it's really great. I think everybody comes, but perhaps for research, I guess one added note would be that we all make part of this rights conversation as also part of our research, right? And not the extra note kind of up there in the air, but so change society and change our research framework as well to include that perspective.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to our panelists and for this really engaging discussion. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Brian Goldman.